I've just finished my shoulder seams. So what we need to do next is going to move on to the front plackets of the jacket. So if you have your iron handy, you want to get that fired up. And what we're going to do is get the back out of the way and flip your jacket over to the wrong side. The wrong side's facing up. So if you have a seam gauge, you'll want to grab that. And we're going to take one of the front pieces and turn the seam allowance along the front edge, and we're going to turn this under by 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So adjust your seam gauge out to 5/8, and we're going to fold one side over, 5/8 inch seam allowance, and we're going to press it down. Until we get all the way to the bottom. Just make sure you have a nice, good, strong press. Okay, so after we have folded and pressed this edge down on the jacket, what we need to do is fold this piece back by 1 inch. So you want to have some of the raw edge or the wrong side of the fabric showing, and this is just folded over. We're not pressing it in place, but what we are going to do is take a pin, and we're just going to pin by 1 inch at the top and just pin it in place. So we're just holding that in place right there. Then we're going to come in using a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and we're going to stitch a 1/2 inch only into the folded section here. So about a 1/2 inch down from the top and over is where we're going to stitch. So you can put a pin in it, you can mark it with some chalk if you want to, but we're going to stitch right across there. Let me zoom in so you can see it even better. So see where I have these pins? We're gonna stitch right across there, only about a 1/2 inch into the fabric. We're not stitching all the way across, we're just stitching a little bit, okay? So let's pop over to our sewing machine and do that now. Okay, so if you couldn't see it very well before, you should be able to see it now. About a 1/2 inch down and over, we're gonna be stitching. So a 1/2 inch in. So that's where your seam allowance goes. I'm gonna do some stitching here. And we don't really need to go all the way in. We just kind of need to go a little bit in, okay? So just make sure you back stitch and everything. So to view it, you can see I've just stitched across here, just a little bit. Okay, so hopefully you can see the part where we stitched. That was a 1/2 inch in from the edge, 1/2 inch down from the edge. We just stitched right across there to kind of tack that area. Now what we need to do is snip vertically into the seam allowance to the end of the 1/2 inch seam that we did. We don't want to cut past the seam, but we do want to cut as close as we can manage it. So we want to grab little tiny scissors if we have them, because these are going to be best for control here. And we want to make this snip. So the snip needs to come right up to the seam, but not past it. So we really need to just use really short scissors or the tip of our longer scissors to get control. Okay, so let's try to do this as carefully as possible. We want to just go right to the tip here of the seam. We don't want to cut through it, we just want to cut to it. Okay, so now you should have a little itty bitty snip there. Now, this should be open, snipped like I just showed you. Okay, now what we're going to do, we need to trim the rest of the seam allowance of this little tiny bit to reduce some of the bulk. So we're going to trim the corner off of the seam allowance of the folded over section here. I'm going to continue snipping. And we want to do that, we want to trim that corner off and through. So we can do that like in a little square. You're basically just cutting off a tiny little square of fabric. You're not cutting through your seam. You're not cutting too in depth there, but hopefully you can see this little square that I've cut off. Okay, now what we can do is turn our placket through and we can actually press it. And we want to poke this corner out that we've stitched. So if you need a chopstick or something pokey, I'm going to actually just use these little scissors I have to poke out that corner, carefully poking it out. Okay, so what we can do now is perfectly turn this placket over and we'll have a nice crisp edge right there. So that's why we did all of that. So let me zoom out, and also I'm going to grab my ironing mat here because we are going to need to do some ironing again here. So we just poked that out, and now I'm going to lay this placket down and we're gonna fold it over and press it. So if you recall before, we pressed that at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance before, but now that we're flipping this over and turning it and all of that, we're actually going to be pressing it closer to about an inch seam allowance now. So just to get everything to fit in the way that we just did it. So if you measure with your seam gauge, you'll notice it's measuring out to be about an inch once it's all been folded over and everything. Isn't it really neat how just something really simple like that can make such a nice interior finish? That placket, I think it's really cool. That's why I like sewing though. Okay, so now what we need to do is top stitch 1/8 of an inch from the edge here of the placket. So if you want to clip or pin this down to keep it down, you can do that. Keep everything in place. For when you're doing your top stitch, just grab some clips, clip it down and in place. That top corner should be fine. Okay, so now we want to top stitch on the front of the jacket 1/8 from the edge, the folded over edge. And then we are also going to follow the line of the raw edge and along the fold. We're going up here and around the corner and all the way down at an 1/8 inch seam allowance. Let's go do that now. This is the top stitching of the front placket. And then when you get to that top piece, pivot again, and stitch up to that raw edge. Okay, so you should have like a nice little corner. And this raw edge is going to get tucked in when we do the collar, so you don't really have to worry about it. Next, we need to top stitch the inside folded part. So we need to top stitch that at approximately 7/8 of an inch in from the folded edge. So if you want to, you can mark that on your sewing machine. Sometimes I like to just pop a little quick piece of washi tape on top of my machine to know where that 7/8 inch marking is, because my sewing machine stops at 6/8. So it is nice sometimes to be able to just pop a quick little seam gauge on. So if you need to do that now. Right there. So we've got 6/8 right here. We need to go out 1 more eighth from where we are at 7/8. It's really hard to do this, but you get the point. Okay, so I know the edge here is my 7/8 marking. So that'll just help me get things lined up better. Okay, and then go ahead and top stitch. We're just gonna go all the way up. So you should have a beautiful placket. Now we need to repeat everything we just did for the other placket. So re-watch the steps I just took if you need a little extra help sewing the placket for the other side. So you should now have 2 really nicely sewn plackets that have been top stitched. Now we're moving on to the collar. In the pattern instructions, it recommends personalizing your Kingston jacket with a little embroidery if you want to, but you could also personalize your Kingston with fancy fabric lining for the collar. If you're doing a contrasting fabric, it might be the perfect time to pop out, you know, a fun lining fabric. The collar won't be showing, so you could put anything you want. Put a little message, put a note. If you're making this for your children, put their name on it so you know which jacket is theirs. You can also do some fun top stitching. Go crazy if you want to. If you don't want to, if you just want a regular collar, then that's what we're going to do here in the sew along. So let's grab our iron, our pressing mat, and our collar pieces, because we will be doing just a little bit of ironing here. What we need to do is fold the bottom edge of the collar piece, not the lining. So if you're using the same fabrics for both the top and the bottom, just pick one and set it aside. And we're going to fold the bottom edge of the collar piece over by 5/8 of an inch, and then we're gonna press. So if you're not sure which edge is the bottom, it's the curved edge here that has a bunch of notches as you go. The top of the collar is the part that only has 1 notch at the top. So we're gonna be folding over the part that has all of the notches. So set your seam gauge to 5/8 inch seam allowance, and we're going to fold it over and press. Press that edge down. Now, we're going to grab the collar lining. So this is our lining. And we're going to place our lining and our main collar with the right sides together. And we're going to clip it or pin it all around the edges. So we want to keep that folded portion going up, like I have it here. Okay, now what we need to do is stitch around the outside at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and we want to leave the bottom open. So when you do get to the folded part right here, you're just going to stitch over that and keep that fold in place, and just go all the way around at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then once we're done with that, we're going to clip the corners to reduce some of the bulk and to help as we turn the collar right side out. So let's go stitch and then we will come back. So you should now have two really nicely sewn plackets that have been top stitched. Now we're moving on to the collar. In the pattern instructions, it recommends personalizing your Kingston jacket with a little embroidery if you want to, but you could also personalize your Kingston with fancy fabric lining for the collar. If you're doing a contrasting fabric, it might be the perfect time to pop out, a fun lining fabric. The collar won't be showing, so you could put anything you want. Put a little message, put a note. If you're making this for your children, put their name on it so you know which jacket is theirs. You can also do some fun top stitching. Go crazy if you want to. If you don't want to, if you just want a regular collar, then that's what we're going to do here in this sew along. So let's grab our iron, our pressing mat, and our collar pieces, because we will be doing just a little bit of ironing here. What we need to do is fold the bottom edge of the collar piece, not the lining. So if you're using the same fabrics for both the top and the bottom, just pick one and set it aside. And we're going to fold the bottom edge of the collar piece over by 5/8 of an inch, and then we're going to press. So if you're not sure which edge is the bottom, it's the curved edge here that has a bunch of notches as you go. The top of the collar is the part that only has one notch at the top. So we're going to be folding over the part that has all of the notches. So set your seam gauge to 5/8 inch seam allowance, and we're going to fold it over and press. Press that edge down. Okay. Now we're going to grab the collar lining. So this is our lining. And we're going to place our lining and our main collar with the right sides together. And we're going to clip it or pin it all around the edges. So we want to keep that folded portion going up like I have it here. Okay. Now what we need to do is stitch around the outside at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and we want to leave the bottom open. So when you do get to the folded part right here, you're just going to stitch over that and keep that fold in place, and just go all the way around at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then once we're done with that, we're going to clip the corners to reduce some of the bulk and to help as we turn the collar right side out. So let's go stitch and then we will come back. All right, you don't have to use top stitching thread. So if you want to save your precious top stitching thread for later, because you'll need it later, go ahead and switch out your threads to just be a regular thread. So I'm just rethreading my machine really quickly here. Now, let's stitch at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and it's okay to get that fold included here. We want to keep that folded down here, folded edge. And when we get to the corner, we do want to pivot. Because we want a nice sharp point for our collar. And we're going to be pivoting again. And stitching over this folded edge. Perfect. So it should look like this, where you've got the folded edge included in that seam. Okay, so we have just stitched the collar pieces together. Now what we need to do is trim our collar pieces just to take down some of the seam allowance and remove some of the bulk off of the corners. So we can cut the seam allowance in half and just trim it down. So let's do that now. And actually, I'm going to remove the ironing mat here for a second. So what I find is best is to just clip straight across at a diagonal at a corner point when you get to a corner point. Okay, once we've trimmed our seam allowance down, we can go ahead and turn the collar right side out and press it with our pressing mat. So you may need to poke the corners out just a bit. And you can do that with a knitting needle or a chopstick or something that you have on hand that will just get that corner nice and poked out for you. I like to use a knitting needle. I know some people don't like to use knitting needles because they get too pokey and they end up poking through the fabric, but you just have to be careful. Oh, I just did it. Okay, so I was not being careful, clearly. So I may need to go back and just stitch around my corner again here because I just poked through that seam so quickly and so easily. Turn everything out and give it a good press on your pressing mat. And you want to make sure that that memory hem that we did already stays folded down. So the one side should be folded down and the other should not be. So we're just pressing the collar down. And we can reinforce that memory hem that we have going just by giving it another good press if we want to. Okay, once we've pressed everything and we're happy with how pressed it is, we are going to fold both the collar and the jacket, so grab your jacket pieces, in half, and we're going to mark the center points. So, easiest way to do that is to bring the jacket together at the seams and mark it with a pin right at the center back. You should also have a notch here. Okay, and then on the collar, fold it in half and mark it at the center. You should also have a notch here, but in case you don't have a notch, just mark it. Okay, once you've done that, I'm gonna get this pressing mat and iron out of the way here. Once we've marked the center points, what we want to do is match the center points. So we're gonna open up the jacket. And now we want to match the center points. So we want the unfolded side here to match the center points here. This is the unmemory hemmed side. And then we're going to pin either end to the collar neckline, matching it at the raw edges here. So we're just gonna go around and pin this in place. And you should have other markings on the collar pieces, and those will align with the side seams. Okay, and just continue to pin the collar on here. Okay, so once you have the collar pinned and we've matched all the raw edges, we've pinned all the way around the rest of the collar, easing it gently together. We will be sewing this with a 5/8 inch seam allowance in order to make sure that everything fits nicely. So I just want to highlight here how this looks, this end. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see I've got it pinned. I've got this end pinned as well. Okay, so it's all eased in, and I've only pinned the lining of the collar to the jacket, not the folded over part. And so the 5/8 inch seam allowance helps the collar to stand up when the jacket's finished. It can make the fitting of the collar tricky, but you should have some slight stretch in your wovens that will allow you to ease into this collar like we did here. If yours doesn't ease, you could always make a few small snips into the seam allowance to help open everything up as you go. And then if you do end up making some snips to kind of help ease everything in, just make sure that you don't snip into the seam any more than a half inch or a quarter inch, half of the way into the seam allowance, or you're going to end up with a hole in your collar. But what we need to do now is actually stitch these pieces together that we've just pinned at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And we want to make sure that we open the collar up as much as we can to get all the way to the corners. So we want to go slowly, and that includes, when I say all the way to the corners, that includes this little end that's folded over. We want to make sure we stitch that down. So if you need to readjust your pin all the way over just a bit so that it hits the end, you do that if you need to. And I may need to adjust a little bit here too, just to make sure. Okay, so let's head over to the sewing machine and we'll take care of it. Okay, this step can get a little bit tricky, especially if you're making some of the smaller kid-size jackets. So just do your best and just try to get everything in there. The 5/8 inch seam allowance is important, so try to stick to that as best as you possibly can as we go. Okay, let's get started. Oh, I should have said you don't need to use top stitching thread for this part either, so just enjoy saving that top stitching thread. All right, good job. You've just done the collar. Okay, so we've just stitched our collar on. We should have a folded edge here that's unattached and free. Just the jacket and the lining of the collar have been sewn together. What we need to do now is make some notches in this seam that we just created in order to make it so that the collar lays flat when you're wearing it. Some sewing methods that you're used to may just recommend that you snip the corners and stuff here, but we don't want to snip the corners. We want to make sure that we have those corners because they'll help us with the edges that we need to have, that strength in the edges to keep everything working. So just snip about part of the way in, little snips. And this is when you want to grab those tiny scissors if you have them. And if you don't have tiny scissors, then just use the tips of your usual sewing scissors to do this. But every so many inches, you want to just cut little notches in. That's going to really help with how this collar lays, getting everything to lay flat. Makes a big difference. I know it seems silly, but it really makes a big difference when you notch things. Just make sure that you don't snip through your actual seams as you're doing this. Just be very careful. Try to really stay keyed in on what you're doing here, so that you don't clip more than you want to. Do this until you come all the way to the other end of the collar. And if you actually have like a little gather here, I have an accidental gather, rip that out and fix it before you clip your seam. Okay, so the next part will be making the optional hanging loop if you're making an optional hanging loop. If you're not, you can go ahead and just ahead to the next part. But what we want to do is get our pressing mat and our optional hanging loop piece, and we're going to be making this just like we would double fold bias tape. So if you are used to making double fold bias tape, then you might not even need to watch this part either. But if you've never made double fold bias tape, we're going to do that right now, and you're going to see how easy it is to do. It's going to be very painless. You're going to be surprised. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is grab your hanging loop piece and fold it in half. And then we're going to press it down. Okay. Once we have a nice crease, open it back up, and we're going to fold one raw edge in towards the middle and press it down. Okay, then we're going to take the other side and fold it in towards the center and press it down. And And then finally, we want to fold this back over itself here and press it down. Now, we need to top stitch on the end to close it on the folded ends to close it up. Top stitch there. You can do another row of top stitching as well if you want to do one so it's balanced. And then we're going to come back and I'll show you how to add that to the collar area. Okay, so we've just top stitched this optional loop. Now what we're going to do is fold the jacket in half again to find the center. Find that center back piece again. And on either side of that center, so I'm just going to stick a pin in there. And then fold it back out. Okay, and then on either side of that center, about 1/2 inch on either side, let's pin the loop up. I'm gonna just zoom in here a little bit here for you to see it better. So 1/2 inch, and we want to make sure the raw ends go up into the part of the jacket we have stitched. So just do your best here. If you can't pin it, just try to clip it in place. And then another 1/2 inch on the other side. We'll put that loop like right here-ish. And from there, you can baste this in place if you'd like, just to make sure that it holds, or you can just skip right ahead and stitch it in place inside of this seam allowance. So you're going to stitch right here just along the edges to ensure that it's tucked into the seam allowance. All right, so if you haven't switched back to top stitching thread, you'll want to do that now. And we're going to stitch all the way around the collar at about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, and when you get to the part where the collar is meeting the jacket, you just want to go extra slow to ensure that you're stitching everything down really nicely. Pivot. And if you did the optional loop, you may have some extra bulk as you go through this part, but that's okay. All right, congratulations. You've just stitched down your collar.